I know this is going to be a good one. So,
I
uh,
hope so.
hope so. I know so. Like psychic, I'm getting the vibes, bro. Getting the vibes. It's northern vibes. You're a geeky academic who has, and I mean that as a geek myself. Like I don't mean that as a pejorative.
Yeah.
You're a geeky academic who has a deep understanding of the public service and the dynamics around that. Is that correct?
Yes, because then I did a lot of reading on why bureaucracies are like they are.
Hmm. And you've written some excellent papers too, which we're going to go into a little bit further, so people can have a look for themselves. But your kind of focus really is on education. So, mate, let's talk about what is wrong with education, because there is a failure. Now, my
Yes.
understanding is that there's a real trend for parents in Queensland to remove their children from state school systems. Now, the exact figures I don't know and really aren't all that relevant, but like, is that true? Like, is that just my perception?
Okay, so there's a couple of things going on. There's a drift away from the public schools, which is happening around the country, partly to private schools, and partly because there's a bit of an upsurge in homeschooling. Um, and that was particularly strong with the COVID lockdowns. So it's particularly strong in Victoria because we had by far the most mad and extensive COVID lockdowns. And so what's been happening is we've got a surge in kids being what we call school refusals. They just won't go to school. It's just basically usually it's anxiety linked, and so they've essentially got to be homeschooled. But you're also getting the other thing is not only did there was a sort of social trauma there, but also of course with a lot more online education, parents got to see what their kids were being taught, and they weren't always all that impressed. So you're getting these trends moving. In the US, for example, there was a massive increase in homeschooling, really big. Um, I'm not up on the exact figures in Australia. I'm just aware that there's been an increase in homeschooling, and there's certainly been an increase in school refusals. So that's a very specific thing. But of course, if the schools were working in the way that parents were happy with, this wouldn't be happening, would it? So it's a reaction that just got intensified by the COVID lockdown experience.
It's indicative of something, and we can't blame it all on COVID. Maybe it was the case, is what I'm hearing there, is maybe it was the case that COVID bought parents because we delegate it. I mean, it's terrible to say, but it's true. It's like we just delegate that
Yeah,
and assume that, they're out there, that, our kids are learning the right stuff. And, parents are, teachers are good people, and they are.
people thought the schools were still doing what they remembered.
Yeah.
So almost everyone went to school. They had an experience. They assumed that they were just sending their children to essentially the same experience,
And
and
that's
that turned out to be entirely true.
that's not what's happened, and we'll go into why. But all right, so like, my understanding too is regarding international academic performance, Australia is falling. Is that the case, or is that again just a map perspective?
Well, it depends on which area you're talking about. But yes, there are some areas where Australia is not doing as well internationally as it used to. Um, and there's a thing called the PISA. I can never remember what PISA stands for, but it's an international assessment of how students are doing at various schooling systems. And yeah, Australia used to do relatively well, and it has been sliding a bit.
Hmm.
Now, of course, with those sort of comparisons, it's harder to know whether it's because we are actually declining, or whether other people pulled their socks and up on doing better, or is it a mixture of those two things? But yes, the PISA results aren't exactly inspiring.
And it's funny you should say that, because I'm involved a fair bit in Indigenous affairs, and one of the dashboard markers that everyone is celebrating is going, Indigenous high school students are doing so much better in the years of like, in the kind of like final years. And as I've pointed out at a couple of meetings, I said, well, okay, you're sitting here trumpeting it, but like, that's probably for two metrics, and I'm not academically trained. Off the top of my head, it's like, hey, we got a lot more people identifying as Indigenous, like a lot. And
Yeah,
they're kind of like,
yeah,
I'm not saying those people aren't Indigenous, but I'm saying that they're not facing the same, social deterministic sort of stuff that's an Indigenous person in Cape York is facing. You know what I mean? It's like,
Yeah,
so,
yeah.
and the second thing is like we're going down. So it's probably, you're getting more people there, and I'm going, and I don't even know why you're, so considering that, this might be a shut the hell up, because it's actually, and if anyone who's smart looks into this and validates the Maloney hypothesis, well, that's again, not something to be celebrated.
On the Indigenous numbers, the ABS actually did some work on this, because the census numbers were showing a dramatic increase in the number of people identifying as Indigenous. And rather grimly, their first big take on it was basically, well, the new people show much the same longevity profile as the old people, so they are actually Indigenous, which is a bit of a grim way of determining the factor. But what it does mean, of course, is a lot of those people are culturally assimilated into the wider Australian community, right? So there's a distinct difference, which you were alluding to there, from people who are very much still living in an Indigenous environment and Indigenous cultures, because there's not one Aboriginal culture, there's a whole series of them. They've got some common patterns, but there's a whole series of cultures. And people who were actually assimilated into the wider mainstream and now are identifying as Indigenous because they have Indigenous ancestry. And that's two very different groups. So you're right, if you're bringing in a lot of people who are largely assimilated, you would expect their education outcomes to be higher, because there's not the cultural barriers. And so, yes, if the group's changed, you can't automatically assume that everyone's gone up. It's just you probably added more people at the top end, so to speak, in student outcomes, who get student outcomes because they are culturally assimilated. So there's a far less barriers to learning and so forth.
Yeah, I mean, someone's discovered that great-great-granddad was Indigenous, and all of a sudden they've decided to identify in that way. I mean, look, I've got a very big splash of Mongolian blood. I used to speak a little bit of the lingo and lived there for a little while, but I'm not Genghis Khan. Here's the problem with that educational downfall, mate, is it spending? Again,
Oh, no.
I'm not asking for
No,
exact
no.
figures, but
Yeah. No, we've continued to spend more and more on education. And internationally, the correlation between educational outcomes and spending is extremely weak. So yes, no, it's not the problem. It's not we're not spending enough money. It's not as if, everyone can tell you we're spending more on education than we used to, even per student. So although that goes up and down a bit, but yes, no, it's not a lack of spending. That's not the issue.
okay, so look, let's talk about why. All right, we know that there is actually a real problem. It's not media hype. It's not just like people sitting around kind of like going, oh my God, things are much worse than they used to be. It's like, no, this is real. So we've got concerns with some of marks in some areas going down. We've got big concerns with kids not going to school. We've got big concerns with parents voting with their feet. So again, it's not Coswallop. There's something going on here. It's Fed income, and we kind of need to know
Yeah,
why. Mate,
and also,
you've written a paper about this. I've read it. I thought it was absolutely splendid. Let's talk about that.
yeah, just to add on, and the other issue that's been going on is it's become increasingly hard to keep teachers, which is a real problem. So yeah, teachers are clearly not enjoying the teaching experience as much as they used to, or they're coming in with very, very warped expectations, which goes to what sort of teacher training they got. But yes, never. Either way, we're having trouble retaining teachers. So yes.
But that's also indicative of a broken system. Again, that's yet another indicator, because no one goes into teaching for the money. You know what I mean? It really is a calling. It's kind of
Yes.
like, it's like being in the police, or it's like being in the, you're not doing that for the dosh. You're doing it because you're satisfying something deeply psychological within you, probably a desire of service and a desire to educate and a desire to help the next generations. So no, again, that's yet another important indicator. But all right, so let's talk about why. So what's the ratio of bureaucrats to teachers in Queensland? And again, I'm not asking for precise figures here. I'm just talking about.
Yeah, the figures. Again, there's a problem with being transparency. It's hard to dig out the figures, but it seems to be that for every for every 2 teachers in the public school system, you've got 1 person who's somehow or other in administration or support. And so roughly, maybe even worse than this, about 2 to 1 teachers to bureaucrats or administrators of various types, and support people of various types. And of course, I can assure you that teachers don't feel supported to that degree at all. So that's a huge administrative overhead for what you're getting. And one of the basic things about bureaucracy, the point of bureaucracy is it regularizes your administration, right? There are procedures, things get, and that can be very useful. That's why we have bureaucracies. If they weren't useful to some degree, we would never have them. But the problem with bureaucracy is also it's got various costs and problems that go with it. And it's got various, what I would call pathological tendencies. So if you're not careful, the bureaucracy expands way beyond what you need it. And in education, for example, there's very few economies of scale. And economies of scale are where bureaucrats are most likely to be useful. They can, regularize across a large number of people.
They're helping.
But if you don't have much, yeah, they can help at that level, yes. But if you don't have much economies of scale, there's much less that bureaucracies and bureaucrats can usefully do. And there aren't very many economies of scale in education. So there shouldn't be a large administrative tail in education. It just shouldn't be there. And that so much resources are being chewed up by this because, of course, these people have to be paid. Many of them are paid rather more than teachers. So if the political system has allocated a certain amount of money to the government school system, and you've got this big administrative tail, then it's chewing up resources which aren't going actually, for example, to teachers and how well you pay teachers or don't pay teachers. So so there's a sort of whole issue about this, about the resources they chew up, about the burdens they put on teachers, the issues that teachers have to deal with just to deal with the bureaucracy, and so forth, making the accountability much more opaque, so it's rather harder to see what's going on, adopting things which help the bureaucracy but don't actually help education, although they will, of course, always be paraded as helping education. The thing about bureaucracies is they always have great intentions. Public intentions are always wonderful. So if they get judged by their intentions, everything's great. But of course, intentions don't guarantee anything. The question is, what are your actual outcomes? What's actually happening? And the indicators are there that this heavy bureaucratic tail is just not serving the students, the teachers, or the public, and particularly not the taxpayers.
Right. All right. So that's kind of like the existence of the size of the bureaucracy in and of itself is a problem.
Yes, absolutely.
I'm hearing with that. All right. Well, great. Well, look, let's talk about some of the more, I suppose, cultural and environmental issues that are going on there. I'd like to talk about parental authority, how it's portrayed in schools, the disciplinary environment in schools. And look, I know to do that, we're actually going to need some definitions here. So if you could tell me what pedagogy is, like,
right.
Yes.
Pedagogy. Yes. Pedagogy is basically the science of teaching, how you teach somebody, the methods of teaching somebody. So how you teach, examining how you teach, looking at how you teach. So that's basically what it is.
Okay.
So
that's great.
So it's like biology is bio, life, ology, study. Pedagogy is teaching or youth, regional narration, study. Yeah. So study of teaching, study of how you teach, the methodology of how you teach.
So parental authority. Let's discuss that. Like, how is that portrayed in the schools and through pedagogy?
Yes. Okay. So the basic thing is that teachers have a duty of care for the students in their care. So your parents send their kids to a school, they are temporarily delegating their authority to the school. So the school can direct the children, the school can discipline the children, But of course, once they leave the school, that delegation ceases, and the parental authority is, once you're back in the care of the parents, the parental authority is reasserted. So it's a temporary delegation, is the way it actually operates. Unfortunately, what you're getting is ideas coming out of and being transmitted through education faculties and elsewhere, which are actually undermining the parental authority of children. Now, this varies by jurisdiction. For example, it's got really bad in California. But where people on the grounds of social justice, and it's usually to do with things like gay issues, trans issues, that sort of thing, where the idea is that the children are under threat from their parents because their parents won't accept them if they're gay, or if they're trans, or so forth. So increasingly the view that schools have a right to withhold key information from parents in order to protect the children, which of course is a direct undermining of parental authority. And the most egregious cases is when the children start socially transitioning at school. So a girl gets treated as if she's a boy, or a boy gets treated as if he's a girl, and the parents aren't told. It also, of course, varies enormously from the school. But yes, I mean, some schools do seem to have a trans issue, and other schools it seems to be absolutely a non-thing. So, and of course, it's going to be vary from school to school how precisely they handle it. But nevertheless, you can certainly say that there is a push that's been quite effective and starts in the United States, and you can't trust won't happen here because we tend to follow their trends at some level. So I can't testify that it's happening in Australian schools, no. But I'd be very surprised if it's never happened anywhere in Australian schools, particularly in a situation where in Victoria, for example, what they call conversion therapy is now actually illegal.
Yeah.
It's a false analogy with what goes on with, because there used to be a thing that was conversion therapy. We can make your child not gay, which is a lie. You can't. But what we call gender dysphoria, which is being alienated from the cultural and physical experience of your sex, if you don't treat that by affirming their gender identity, that is called conversion therapy, which of course it's not. Yeah. It's what used to be the just normal treatment for people undergoing there's alienation from their body, gender dysphoria, which I think really should be called sex dysphoria, because if you're alienated from the cultural expectations of your sex, that could just mean that you're a tomboy, yeah, or a sissy, or so forth, or gay, right? Because gay kids, gay and young,
you have a feminine
yeah,
form.
they're going to be somewhat, they're going to be somewhat alienated from their cultural expectations. That's just going to happen, and you work your way through it normally. It's if you're really seriously alienated from the physicality of your sex, then you've got a really much more likely to be a serious problem. Yes, and this has happened, and it's something that there are various appropriate treatments for. But just saying, oh, therefore you're trans, therefore we must affirm you, that is not a good approach. Yet in Victoria, for example, it's been legislated. Yeah.
So I mean, it's going to happen. And when you consider the centralized nature of a state system, we've just been talking about, like, the entire point of having a state education system is that it's consistent through the state. I'm going to read something from your paper, and then we'll get you to define and explain and expand. So I'm talking about here about the intellectual movement of critical social justice. So you say critical, critical pedagogy, queer theory, and related intellectual movements that fall under the umbrella of critical social justice seek to flatter teachers by claiming their mastery of such ideas gives them the moral authority and capacity to be change agents, understood not in some conventional pedagogical sense of transmitting skills, knowledge, and heritage, but as agents of directed social change. These ideas have multiple problems, including false understanding of human development, dubious characteristics of existing society, overblowing claims about their understanding of social dynamics, and crowding out student acquisition of broadly useful skills and knowledge. And I think that's the really important bit. Such approaches show a perverse hostility to the authority of parents and of the citizenry, for such approaches have not been subject to democratic scrutiny. Indeed, they resist such scrutiny. Now, that's not going to make you popular with the Queensland Teachers Union, and not going to make you popular with all kinds of others. Like, if I can quote Sir Humphrey Appleby, a very brave statement, Minister. But let's define and discuss.
Yes, just a pause here. Although I did actually write that section, the paper you're referring to, I'm not the only author. I just contributed some ideas and part of the writing to it. Yes. Now, yes. So critical social justice is a sort of umbrella term for all the movements like critical pedagogy, critical race theory, queer theory, and so forth. And basically, the idea is it sees Western societies as fundamentally structured by power relations and oppressive relations, where various groups are marginalized, i.e., oppressed, and what people should be doing is they should be overcoming that oppression and marginalization. So with critical race theory, for example, the idea is the question is not whether racism is present. The question is, how is racism operating in this situation? Because Western societies are inherently racist, or they're inherently patriarchal, or they're inherently heteronormative, or whatever. So, and they all use some sort of template of there's a oppressive group that has a certain form of property that oppresses the marginalized groups, and the society has to be fixed by getting rid of that oppression and that form of property. So the original version of this is there's a group called the bourgeoisie who own capital, which excludes the proletariat who get oppressed, and you've got to abolish capital in order to transform into a society without oppression, which of course is Karl Marx, right? But you get versions of this. There's white people who have a property called whiteness, which excludes people of color, and you've got to get rid of whiteness in order to, and there's a group of people called men who have a property called patriarchy, who, and so on and so on and so forth. If you go, and the sort of original founder of critical pedagogy, which is Paulo Freire, and yes, that's not how you pronounce his name, but I can't do the Brazilian Portuguese, who said basically there's literacy knowledge, there's the people who have that, they have literacy knowledge, they exclude the illiterate, and you can only liberate society when people understand the nature of their exclusion and oppression. So they have to be conscientized. They have to develop a critical consciousness which allows them to understand their oppression, and that's really the fundamental thing that schooling should be aimed at.
So not teaching them how to read and write, and not passing on history as we understand it. Like that's just ideological. There's nothing else. I don't even want to use the word brainwashing because it's got all these implications with it, but it really is. And you can see how that would appeal to some teachers, though, Michael. Like, especially kind of ones that aren't all that competent. It's like, well, my kids can't read, write, and add up or spell, and they don't know they don't know why 1066 is an important date in Western history. But by God, they know they're oppressed, and they've been asking for kid litter in the toilet rooms, and hey, job done. You know what I mean? It's kind of, you could see why this would happen.
Yeah. So, for example, Paulo Freire was originally educating illiterate peasants in South America, right? Making them literate. And so it's adults. He's talking about adults, but this has been translated into how to teach children. But he was very much against phonics, which is teaching kids to read by associating letters and sounds, right?
Yeah.
Which for most people is by far the most effective way for them to learn to read.
Yeah.
But
I've got to duck in here. I want to duck in, keep your train of thought. But And Noel Pearson will agree with you. And Noel Pearson introduced Schools for Cape York precisely saying that when I lived in Cape York. And it caused outrage, this idea that he was introducing phonics. And I was like, it's a good thing.
It's what works for most people. Yeah. Okay. So his response is what you do is you do generative teaching, where you use words to generate ideas, and it's a whole word recognition system and so forth. Now the problem is there are some people who learn to read like that, and to be blunt, they tend to be of the higher IQ people. That's how they tend to, not always the case, but that's how they tend to read. And of course, high IQ people go to universities and they become academics. And so that generative system makes sense to them because that's how their memory of how they learn to read. But of course, for most people, phonics works way, way, way better. And particularly in a society and culture which was never literate. Literacy is something introduced to it, right? So from outside. So yes, so I was aware years ago about the thing about phonics, and I used to wonder where it came from. And it turns out that a big factor in it is Apollo Freire and his opposition to phonics, because phonics, doing it by phonics, just learning the sounds, that's just a technical process of learning to be literate.
Yeah.
Right? The cat's out on the mat. What he wants is a process whereby you conscientize people, you change their outlook on the world. And so just doing phonics won't do that for you. But if you've got generative words, right, you generate emotional responses to particular words, and you can use that to change their outlook on the world. So that's why he wanted to go that way. And as so much of this stuff, it is not based on good teaching practice, not even remotely. If you read his original book, which is The Pedagogy of the Oppressed, there's more or less no, it's not a very long book, it's a tedious read, but it's not a very long book. There's almost no reference at all to anything even vaguely resembling serious pedagogical research. His references are people like Che Guevara and Fidel Castro and Mao Zedong and Lenin and so on and so on and so on and so forth, right? So this is about political activism and social activism parading itself as pedagogy.
Yeah, and that's all it is. I think this is one of your other sentences here, and I'm just going to, obviously, if you wrote it, you couldn't agree with you more on this, but I just want to check that I interpreted this correctly, and I think this encapsulates what we've been saying. It's not so much that the schools are teaching Marxism or cultural theory, so that's the ideas of Foucault and Derrida directly. So they're not teaching Marxism. It's more accurate to say that education has been Marx and Foucault and Derrida-sized. So it's been Marxicized. So it's the process itself, not so much the content. So even then, you could look at the content and go, tell me where it says you shall love Karl Marx. Show me where it says that. That's not the point. That's not what we're claiming. That's not what's happening. It's the process that's been kind of like the process itself that's being contaminated. I'll use that word. I don't mind.
Yeah. Well, for example, there's the ongoing controversy in the States about critical race theory in schools, and people like Christopher Rufo was saying this stuff is pervading the schools because it came in for the teachers' colleges, education faculties. And the people on the other side would say, but we're not teaching critical race theory. And as a theory, that is perfectly true. They're not teaching critical race theory. They're just taking all the concepts and putting it into the curriculum and putting it into the teaching. So yes, they don't line up the students and teach them critical race theory as a formal theory. They just use all these concepts from critical race theory in the teaching, right? And there's a whole literature on this. There's books on this from advocates of this sort of thing, where they're quite open about what they're doing. But of course, that would require journalists to actually read, rather than just press releases.
So really, I mean, it's the interpretive lens that things are being looked through, And Jordan Peterson talks about this, where he says, "Hey, look, we've kind of like, look, I don't know whether or not to, and I have not read Derrida or Foucault directly. Okay, so I haven't. I've only read papers doing this, so I'm kind of like, I'm relying on trusted authorities myself when it comes to this. But it's kind of like they wanted to, de-logos-size Western society. So remove the logos. It's a fellow. How did Derrida describe it? A fellow logic. Fellow logic.
Logocentric.
They're logocentric. And it's like, yes, which is basically to say Judeo-Christian, really, because, the logos, as described by Peterson, is like, it's love motivating truth. So that's your guide. Like that's your guiding lens that you're looking at the world through. It's like, tell the truth and be motivated by love and tell the truth. Whereas this is completely and utterly moving things, going, there is no such thing as truth. There is no such thing as love. The only thing there really is power. The only reality of any relationship between two human beings is a power dynamic. It's oppressive. So you've just got to figure out what you've got to be looking for is not an opportunity to be motivated by love and guided by truth, but to open your eyes to where you're being oppressed. And then try and get up that hierarchy so that you're pushing more people down than being pushed down. Like it's
yes.
brilliantly devious.
Yes. So a lot of this stuff, I mean, again, people say, well, Foucault was more sophisticated than that and Derrida was more sophisticated than that. Yeah, maybe. But what happened is key elements of their ideas were then adapted into this stuff. And it gets adapted into the critical social justice. So yes, it's not pure Foucault and it's not pure Derrida, and it's being redone by people who aren't as clever as Foucault and Derrida. But nevertheless, key ideas from these people are then taken across and used in the literature. And yes, absolutely. And oddly enough, one of the big critics of people like Foucault is Noam Chomsky.
Yes, I know. How funny is that, right?
Yeah. Okay. The crucial thing here is Noam Chomsky is a Darwinian. He completely accepts Darwin's theory of evolution. And his own linguistic contribution was basically saying, look, if human brains weren't structured to learn languages, we wouldn't be able to learn language as easily as we do. So therefore, there has to be structures in our brains which allow us to do this. And we can see deep patterns in in languages, which reflect that. So this is a very, very Darwinian theory, right? So the guy takes the theory of evolution completely seriously because his own intellectual work, which made him famous originally, is based on it. So he goes to people, looks at people like Foucault and just basically says, you people, you don't grasp that we're evolved beings.
You're not getting
that
it.
Evolution is, yeah, and he regards their effect of he both disagrees with them intellectually at a deep level because he's a Darwinian, and they're not. And I'll come back to that in a minute. But the other thing is he really, really despises the political consequences because he thinks it encourages people to end up playing performative moral word games rather than getting building better lives for ordinary people. He's, of course, correct in that criticism. Both his criticisms are correct, right?
So they virtue signal rather than actually engage in the revolution.
Yeah, or even just improve people's lives, right? Yeah. So, right, which to be fair for Noam Chomsky, he's in favour of. Yes, he's he wants social transformation, but in the meantime, he'd like you to improve people's lives, and these people don't, or the ideas that they're generating don't. And so he's got the double criticism of it. And as I said, both criticisms are absolutely spot on. Now, the thing that actually Chomsky talks about this, which is something I hadn't been quite aware of. He'd picked up that these people he were arguing with didn't seem to have any sort of evolutionary biological framing to what they thought at all. And what he hadn't really, he mentioned that to a couple of French biologist friends. And they explained to him, you've got to understand, French biology did not accept Darwin. There was a very small number of biologists who were Darwinians in the 1940s. One of them was very, brave in the resistance. And as reward, he got a laboratory, and basically all the decent Darwinian French biologists have come from his laboratory, or the students who went through that laboratory. But what that means is the wider French intellectual milieu just hadn't absorbed Darwinian thought. So even though they're all born, decades after Darwin published The Origin of Species in 1859, they're of a broad intellectual milieu which just hasn't absorbed Darwinian thought at all. So they're in that sense, they're pre-Darwinian, even though they're decades later. And so a lot of this stuff, I've never read much Derrida because he's unnecessarily hard to read.
Yeah, I
But
tried.
when
I tried. I just didn't get it.
yeah. No, look, if you're a writer, you've got an obligation to be clear to your readership. I have very little respect for people who write in very obscure ways. I think that's just a nasty game, cognitive game they're playing.
Yeah.
If your ideas are difficult, that just means you take more effort to be clear and to spell them out. Anyway, so, but you look at, when you do try and get your head around his ideas, you think, this makes no sense. His attitude to language makes no sense if you view language as an evolutionary product, as something that we evolved to do. Why would we have language? Well, language has to do things for us in an evolutionary context. And there's, of course, a whole literature about trying to work out the evolution of language. But, as has been famously said, nothing in biology makes sense except in the light of evolution. And for language to evolve, it has to have served the purposes of our ancestors in a way which made it more likely that they have children. It's got to have served the lineage. That's what's selected for in evolution is what serves the lineage, what makes you reproduce successfully and keep reproducing and so forth down the generations.
I mean, these words stick in my throat, but I think Chomsky is right, because really the way you're explaining it, this is what I'm interpreting, and obviously correct me if I'm wrong, is they're not even linguistic creationists in the sense that there's a benevolent God above. They're more like linguistic intelligent design, but that intelligent designer is evil. So it'd be like this, not, this kind of like, no, seriously, like, because, so that's kind of like where they're coming from there. It's like, okay, this ability has come kind of like, has made a leap from, ex nihilo, from nothing into something, you know what I mean? And it's like, so something is kind of like done that. There's this, and it's just linguistically, I suppose it's because too, we actually don't, anyway, I suppose we're diverting because we don't really know about how language, well, I don't really know how language evolved. So, I'd imagine people out there
there's a fair bit of work on it. We haven't got, as I understand it, we haven't got a fully settled comprehensive theory. There's various hypotheses which are being developed, all very interesting. Because the problem is, of course, that language doesn't need fossil records.
Yeah.
So I'm trying to work in that. Yeah, but the thing to remember is that this is you're picking up something there. This is indeed humans as a special creation idea, right? Yeah. We've got language no one else has. We did it ourselves by some magical process. And where does all this originally come from? It originally comes from Marx, and it originally comes from ideas that Marx wrote down in the 1840s. Right. So The Origin of Species is published in 1859.
Yep.
This is pre-Darwinian in quite straightforward sense. And Marx makes a big deal about humans are the only self-conscious beings. And so when we create the vision of what we create. And the idea is to create a unity of theory and practice so that our vision is fully reflected in what we do, and what we do is fully reflected in our vision. And of course, that means if you're working for somebody else in an employer relationship, you're serving their vision, not yours. So therefore, you're alienated from your product. This will sound familiar. It's the basic idea of Marxism. And what you can do with this, of course, you can take versions of that and rerun it. But yes, if you look into why is language a thing in itself, there's clearly a connection to, well, we humans are so special because we're self-conscious and we act according to our vision. Yes. And you think, yeah, how to become self-conscious? Why do we get language? Yes. And you don't have a story for that. You just certain way you go. But if you go back to, well, we have language for a reason, well, then language's got to be functional, hasn't it?
Yeah.
And language has to evolve pointing outside itself. It can't be a completely interior system because then it would have no evolutionary point.
Right. Yeah. You can't have a self-reflecting 100%. All right. And that's obviously what these people mean when they talk about decolonization. So it's like, okay, we have to remove this idea, this idea that language has evolved, that it has meaning and point, that meaning and point is good, that it drags us in the direction of good rather than evil. Again, it's like intelligent and like, yeah, it's intelligent design by an evil God. Kind of like, yeah. So
Well,
it's like, so when people, actually, I'll ask this directly. I have an idea of what I think it means when they say decolonize. Because the way it's kind of like, well, just removing the way it's sold, it's just like, hey, let's just not make this Eurocentric. And like, you know, when that first came to me, I was like, oh yeah, I love learning about China. I love learning about India. It's like, yeah, hey, you know, let's broaden the net. But again, we're using the same words, but we're speaking different languages. That's not what they mean. What they mean is
yeah,
completely removing the different, as we're talking about at the beginning. So removing the kind of like logos idea out completely and sticking what we've just been discussing here. Is that kind of correct? Do you think that that's what decolonization means?
decolonization means characterizing the Western heritage as essentially imperialistic, colonial, and oppressive. And so you've got to take out the Western heritage because otherwise you're celebrating and perpetuating what is oppressive, imperialistic, and colonizing, right? So what it basically says is the core of the Western heritage is that it's imperialist, colonial, and oppressive, which of course is not true.
That's Coswell.
Yeah. So and the thing is, of course, that their vision is based on this glorious imagined future without oppression, right? Which means that the future becomes heaven, the past becomes hell because it's full of marginalization and so forth, and the present becomes either purgatory or hell continued, right? So, and yes, so if it's the society is fundamentally oppressive, then what is creating the society around us is evil. So it's this sort of demiurgic idea, you know, the proletariat dominate everything through their control of capital, therefore they effectively have demiurgic power.
Yep.
Creating society, and we have to be liberated from this demiurgic power. If men control everything through the patriarchy, then and blah 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 blah. If white people control everything, blah 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 blah. It's all this demiurgic power that is creating this morass of oppression that we're stuck in.
It's so Gnostic.
It's all nonsense.
Yeah, it's so Gnostic. It's
Oh,
so
deeply Gnostic. Deeply Gnostic. And it's also hermetic, because if you got the correct critical consciousness, you can liberate everyone from this, right? Which is the hermetic idea of liberating knowledge. So it's marrying together that hermetic idea of liberating knowledge, and we are in an oppressive environment created by basically an evil social creator. Yes, it's secularized Hermeticism and it's secularized Gnosticism, but it's deeply Hermetic and deeply Gnostic.
Yeah. Thank you, Arian. But but just to explain to listeners what we meant by that, because like you obviously we're speaking in religious terms. One of the basic ideas of Gnosticism was this: it's a distorted form of Christianity. The idea, and I'm very much oversimplifying here, is that there was a good creator God who created kind of everything, but things got kind of like hijacked by this sub-God who we know now as Yahweh, who misrepresented himself as the creator of the world to like gain power from the actual proper creator. So that's why there is evil and nastiness in the world. That's why there's evil, nastiness, and suffering and stuff like that. None of that stuff was supposed to be there. If the powerful God's intention had been there and he hadn't been subverted by this Yahweh guy, none of that would have existed. But the big God sent Christ down to like fix things up and remove all this kind of stuff. But he wasn't answering. So when he talks about God in the Bible, he wasn't talking about Yahweh God of Abraham and Isaac. He was talking about this higher spiritual being. Now, even if you're not religiously inclined and you know very little about the Bible, it doesn't take much to understand that completely and utterly undermines Christianity as we understand it. That's not Christianity. That's not even close to Christianity. So
Yeah.
we're getting a pattern. I think where Michael and I are getting, and please correct this, but we're getting a pattern of an old Gnostic heresy that's just dressing itself up and coming back. That's all that's really
Yes.
happening.
Yes. The slight um, amendment to what you said there is there's the original of all things who creates a spiritual world,
Yeah.
and demiurgic God creates the material world, which traps spiritual souls within it. So that's just a slight. So the material creation is from the demiurge, but it's trapping, the spirit, the individual spirits, us, in this material existence, which is fundamentally evil because it separates us from the absolute original God. But yes, that's the idea.
And you can see why that would come out, because you see the hatred of the body. You see the hatred of the body as evil. So rather than looking at the human body and go, hey, look, it's got its limitations. It's finite. We're going to die. You suffer, but it's still good. And you can see why and when we talk about, because when I say body, obviously I'm in the human body there, but there are other bodies that we've created. Like society is a body, what I mean? It's an extension of the body. So you could see this hatred of physicality and the body, that everything has to be like in this pure, perfect, spiritual. It's just odd. It's so strange.
The idea becomes that any constraint is oppression.
Yeah. Yeah.
So how can you characterize the least oppressive and most successful societies in human history as oppressive? You define constraint as oppression. So again, it's a case of they use your language, but they don't use your dictionary.
Yeah.
And yes, so it's and then so the bourgeois have the demiurgic power that traps the proletariat. White people have the demiurgic power that traps people of color. Men have the demiurgic power that traps women, and so on and so on and so on and so forth. And yes, it's deep nonsense. Now, for example, let's start with imperialism. Imperialism is what states do. The minute you have states, you have imperialism, right? It's just what happened is the West was good at creating very effective states, so therefore they created very effective imperialism. But imperialism has nothing to do with the West specifically or capitalism specifically. It has to do with states. If states can be imperial, they are. Why? Because there's more resources and power and authority to the people running the state, obviously. So the minute you have states, you start having imperialism. The Assyrians were very, very, very imperialistic. They weren't Westerners, and they weren't capitalist in any useful sense, but they were deeply imperialistic. And again and again, you see this. So the imperialism is specifically Western is just nonsense. Slavery is specifically Western is also nonsense. The Islamic slave trade operated centuries before the Atlantic slave trade started. Colonizing, people do that again. That's a very old pattern. Homo sapiens started in Africa and then proceeded to colonize everywhere else.
Yeah, the Middle East,
everywhere else, right? So we're all colonizers, and in fact, one of the sort of deeper rifts in human history is that Australians understand this reference. Outside Africa, we humans are vermin. We're like rabbits. There are no local evolved enemies, and we just go whoosh. But if you stayed in Africa, unfortunately, you had a whole lot of pathogens, predators, parasites, and megaherbivores who co-evolved with humans and could deal with them. So Africa was not actually, despite the fact we evolved there, it wasn't actually a great place for humans a lot of the time because everyone else had evolved around us, right? But elsewhere, we're vermin, we're new, whoosh, away we go.
And if you don't believe me, ask the mowers or the
indeed. Oh, indeed, yes. Okay. Or the Moriori dealing with the Maoris, yes.
Or a diprotodon. You want to ask them?
Yeah. So when they say, there's imperialism and colonialism and oppression in Western history, all they're saying is we're Homo sapiens. Because, Homo sapiens with states are imperialistic. Homo sapiens with power who can get away with it are oppressive. Homo sapiens who see new opportunities are colonizers. It's just what Homo sapiens do if they got the opportunity. It's nothing to do with being specifically Western. Now, the difference in Western society is, we were particularly good at creating states. But But we were also really, really good at cooperating.
Yeah.
Because the great advantage of Homo sapiens is we do non-kin cooperation way better than any other species. So you look at, for example, ants, right? Ants, they're in the nest, they're all related. They're all children of the queen. So it's in fact an enormous family. So that's kin. And you look at all the what we call the eusocial insects, bees, ants, termites, and so forth. They're all kin cooperation, right? Honeybees are a slightly more complex case, but still basically kin cooperation. We Homo sapiens are really good at cooperating people we're not related to.
Mm.
But what happened in Western civilization is, for various reasons, Western civilization became really, really, really good at non-kin cooperation. So created very effective commercial systems, very effective financial systems, very effective states. And since states are what imperialism, what states do, if you have the most effective states in the world, you're going to have the most effective imperializers, which is imperialists, which is why, of course, Western countries took over most of the planet. They just created better states. It's not that they were something intrinsically evil about Western culture or Western society or anything like that. They were just Homo sapiens with very effective states.
Mm.
Hence,
Donald Ferguson talks about that with his 6 killer apps that Western civilization has, and there's all these other discussions around what it is. And of course, the fundamental thing that you're talking about there is having the non-kin cooperation. I saw this when I lived in China. Allows trust. All right, it really kind of facilitates a relationship of trust. And look, that that comes from Judeo-Christianity. Really, I mean, there's just no denying that kind of that fact. Even I would suggest that even an atheist Darwinian would give the demiurge his due when it comes to when it comes to that kind of stuff. That's where Tom Holland discusses that. Even the magnificent Helen Dale, who I know that you're kind of like acquainted with, hints at this in her books, going, well, Rome was kind of barbaric, like there was a civilizing influence going on there. I mean, that's a gift for that. But the point being is it allows trust, because capitalism works on trust, right? Really, that is the fundamental.
effective commercial. Yes.
When I talk to people about this, like, they go, oh, capitalism works on this and this. I said, no, it doesn't. It works on trust. I said, have you ever ordered anything online? I said, yeah. 8 times that, you hand someone some money from the other side of the world, they're going to send stuff. You're trusting them. You're trusting that person.
Yeah. Yes.
That's
the way I would put it. The way I put it, I don't actually like the term capital and capitalism, because I think it's actually not very descriptive of what we're talking about.
Yeah,
what we're talking about here is commerce. And commerce absolutely relies on people having a certain level of trust. You make an agreement with them, you're trusting them to keep the agreement. You make a contract with them, you're trusting them to keep the contract. Now, of course, you have, because people aren't always reliable, you have mechanisms to deal with that when it falls through. But it wouldn't function without the presumption that most of the time it's going to work, right? And Christianity is very important in all this, although I would put it slightly more complexly, which is what happened is because Christianity grows up in the Roman Empire, right? So it's deeply influenced by the Roman structures.
Mm-hmm.
And what did Rome do? And the Greeks also, of course, but particularly Rome, because they're the ones that come out on top. Single spouse marriage, right? One husband, one wife. That's it. That creates a situation where you've got partnership marriages because you've got a common interest in your children, which means that when the husband's away, who do you leave in charge? The wife. We take that for granted in Western civilization. If you're a polygynous situation where one husband, several wives, and they're all competing for their children, husband goes away, you don't put one of them in charge, right? That's not how it works. So what means that non-kin cooperation, women in Western Roman civilization and then Christian civilization, which grew out of it, used the talents of women, particularly elite women, much, much better than the other civilizations did. So that's part of the non-kin cooperation, because you're married. That's a sort of created relationship, right? But it did other things. It broke up kin groups. So if you break up kin groups, clans and so forth, except in the in the fringe in the Balkans and in the Celtic fringe. But elsewhere, they broke up king groups, which means you've got to find other ways to cooperate.
Hmm.
Rome said law was human, which Christianity then agreed with, right? Render unto Caesar the things of Caesar, render unto God the things of God. Law is human, which means if you make a bargain, you can entrench it in law. So you can have parliamentarism because it works,
Contract.
right?
There's a contract.
Yeah.
Yeah. So the idea of a
Yeah.
contract between the people, the contract, yeah. Yeah.
Yeah.
100%.
And then you can put it in the law. Yeah. So you can get parliamentarism, which came from the Germans, but yes, you get parliamentarism. And you got things like the church was really big on people having wills, right? Why was the church big on that? Well, they were rather hoping that they would donate something in their will to their church, okay, obviously. But it has a really big impact because it means individuals control their property, including, not unimportant, widows control their property, right? So, and they say you can't marry your cousin or any other person you're related to, and they make that quite a broad definition. So you, for example, you can't marry any member of your godparents' family because that was regarded as incest. So yes, so you've got to marry out, you've got to have substitute for your king groups, you've got to find all these ways of cooperating. You can entrench your bargains in law because law is human, right? So what Christianity did is it sort of sanctified these ideas that Romans had come up with, and then added charity in, which the Romans didn't have.
Well,
The
yes,
Romans did not have charity.
I'll totally accept the commercial aspect of that, but see, when we talk about human rights and the other aspect of that, and even citizenship, like a lot of that contractual stuff was dependent on citizenship, right? So you still have the otherness.
Yeah, but the Romans had citizenship, but they didn't have care for the poor. They didn't have charity. They didn't have a broader conception of compassion. So, yes, I would argue very strongly that the Christian church sanctified various parts of the Roman, what I call the Roman synthesis, but they certainly added things to it, which is Tom Holland's point.
Yeah, and they went even deeper. Like, there's no denying Galatians. In Christ Jesus, there is no such thing as Jew or Gentile, man or woman or slave, or I've even had some trans people throw that at me. But it's kind of like, you forgot the kicker, in Christ Jesus. So it's like, so what that means, there's kind of like something in that there too. But I think it's so that goes beyond. I mean, I would argue, and I don't want to go too much down this because I really want to get medieval, like really quickly actually. But I really think, again, Tom Holland and everyone else they're starting to get this. Like, speaking as a kind of reactionary Catholic, it's like I accept a lot of these things were intrinsic, and I'm sounding a bit like Aquinas here. Were intrinsic in a lot of these systems that kind of like existed. Aquinas was big with this. It's like, hey, dude, if it's good, it comes from God. Like, and he's going to manifest himself in some ways. Like, even you're never going to get a society you're going to get societies that's based on evil, but you're always going to get something like, even in Mussolini's places, the trains ran on time. Like, there's going to be some sort of redeeming thing in there. You know what I mean? But it's like this idea that every human being, slave, and, St. Paul specifically talks about that for a reason, slave and master, man and woman. Like, again, these apparently, so you've got a power dynamic there, and then you've got another power dynamic, again, to give the wokies their due, between a man and a woman, a husband and a wife, although it's kind of like a different power dynamic. All these things just saying, hey, look, ultimately we're kind of like, and all that's doing too really is reiterating the fact that we're all daughters of Adam and sons of Eve. That's just bringing that together and a reminder that we really are all related.